Imagine walking through corridors where silence was so absolute it became a weapon, where walls 3 feet thick weren't built to keep prisoners in but to trap their screams inside, where 20 human beings were compressed into cells designed for 3 with ventilation slits measuring exactly 10 centimeters wide. This is Seodaemun Prison in Seoul, Korea. Built in 1907 for the equivalent of $16 million in today's money, it was never designed to rehabilitate criminals. It was engineered as a machine to break the human spirit with mathematical precision. For 40 years, this facility perfected techniques of psychological destruction that would be copied by authoritarian regimes worldwide. Cell 12 alone processed thousands of political prisoners, many of whom emerged unable to speak their own names. The Japanese didn't just want to punish Korean independence activists. They wanted to erase the very idea of resistance from human memory. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. The machine built to create silence became the loudest testimony to its own failure. Every torture technique was documented. Every architectural detail was measured. Every psychological experiment was recorded by the prisoners themselves, who transformed their suffering into forensic evidence that would survive long after their oppressors disappeared. Today, we're opening the classified files on how this system actually worked. Not just the obvious brutalities, but the subtle engineering of despair. The acoustic design that made footsteps echo like thunder. The temperature control that turned Korean winters into instruments of torture. The overcrowding equations that reduced human beings to mathematical problems. This isn't just history. It's a blueprint for recognizing how systematic oppression operates in any era, under any flag, justified by any ideology. The techniques perfected at Seodaemun didn't die with the Japanese Empire. They evolved, adapted, and spread. If you're ready to understand how freedom dies through architecture and bureaucracy, how resistance survives in impossible conditions, and why some buildings become monuments to human endurance rather than human defeat, then join me for this forensic investigation into one of history's most efficiently designed machines of oppression, because the most dangerous prisons aren't remembered for their escapes. They're remembered for what they tried to erase and failed to destroy. The year is 1907. Dawn breaks over Seoul, and on a hill overlooking the city, something terrible is taking shape. Not a fortress, not a palace. A machine designed to break the human spirit with surgical precision. This is Seodaemun Prison, and if you've never heard of it, there's a reason. Some stories are buried not because they lack importance, but because they reveal too much about what human beings are capable of when they decide that control matters more than conscience. The hill watches everything. That was the point. Japanese colonial officials didn't choose this location by accident. They wanted elevation. They wanted visibility. They wanted every citizen of Seoul to look up and see the gray stone walls cutting against the sky like a scar. From the prison windows, inmates could see the city below, markets bustling, children playing, life continuing as if their suffering didn't exist. The architects understood psychology. Hope becomes torture when it's visible but unreachable. The distance between the hill and the city might as well have been 1,000 miles. But why build a prison here at all? Korea in 1907 wasn't dealing with a crime wave. Bank robberies weren't plaguing Seoul. The real criminals in the eyes of the Japanese Empire were ideas. Dangerous ideas about independence, about dignity, about the right to exist as Koreans rather than subjects. Traditional execution was quick. Too quick. It created martyrs instantly. But a prison? A properly designed prison could do something far more valuable. It could break spirits slowly. It could turn resistance into submission. It could teach an entire population that fighting back wasn't just futile, it was insane. The land itself had to be silenced first. Before the first brick was laid, Japanese authorities moved against the families who had lived on Seodaemun Hill for generations. No compensation, no appeal process, no discussion. Villagers watched their homes demolished to make room for something they couldn't yet understand. The silence began before the walls rose. That wasn't an accident. It was policy. Total control requires total erasure of what came before. The hill's history as a place where families raised children and grew vegetables had to be eliminated completely. Only then could it become something else entirely. Colonial planning documents from 1906 reveal the mathematical precision of this cruelty. Budgets allocated for concrete and steel, architectural specifications for cell dimensions, detailed cost projections for labor and materials. But nowhere in these documents will you find the word rehabilitation. Nowhere will you find any mention of reform or redemption or second chances. What you will find, buried in bureaucratic language, is something far more chilling. References to psychological pressure, studies of sensory deprivation, research into the breaking point of human resistance. This wasn't a prison being planned. This was a laboratory. The Japanese Empire had studied Western prison design extensively. The panopticon concept fascinated them. Jeremy Bentham's vision of perfect surveillance, where prisoners never knew if they were being watched, seemed like the ultimate tool of control. But they modified it, improved it, made it worse. Where Western prisons pretended to serve justice, Seodaemun would serve empire. Where Western prisons maintained the fiction of eventual release, Seodaemun would focus on permanent psychological destruction. The goal wasn't to house criminals. The goal was to manufacture fear. Construction began in early 1907, and from the first day, something was wrong. The materials tell the story. Concrete walls 3 feet thick. Not for security. Prison walls half that thickness could prevent escapes. These walls were designed for something else entirely. They were designed to trap sound, to trap heat in summer and cold in winter, to create a microclimate of misery. Korean laborers built this monument to their own oppression. They had no choice. The alternative was starvation. They mixed the concrete that would entomb their neighbors. They laid the bricks that would muffle the screams of their children. The irony was intentional. Nothing breaks a people like forcing them to build the instruments of their own destruction. The winter of 1907 was particularly brutal. Temperatures dropped below freezing for weeks. The construction workers struggled to keep the concrete from cracking. But the Japanese overseers weren't concerned about structural integrity. They were concerned about something else entirely. They wanted to test how these materials would behave in extreme cold, how stone floors would conduct freezing temperatures directly into human bones. Budget documents from this period reveal a disturbing pattern. Cost-cutting measures eliminated heating systems, eliminated proper ventilation, eliminated basic sanitation facilities. But at the same time, funding increased dramatically for one specific area: interrogation facilities. The basement level received the most expensive materials: soundproof walls, specialized lighting, drainage systems designed for easy cleaning. The builders weren't installing these features for prisoner comfort. They were installing them for efficiency, for the kind of efficiency that left no evidence behind. By autumn of 1908, Seodaemun prison was complete. The opening ceremony was deliberately modest. No speeches, no ribbon cutting, no celebration. The Japanese understood that this facility would speak for itself. Its reputation would spread through whispers, not proclamations. The first prisoners arrived before the paint was dry. Not murderers, not thieves, not rapists, teachers, students, poets, farmers who had dared to speak Korean in public instead of Japanese. Their crime wasn't what they had done. Their crime was who they were. The cells were designed for 3 prisoners each. By the end of the first month, they held 10. By the end of the first year, some cells held 20. This wasn't overcrowding by accident. This wasn't poor planning. This was deliberate compression, a physical equation designed to suffocate not just bodies, but souls. Cell 12 became the most notorious. 20 prisoners crammed into a space designed for 3. Ventilation slits less than 10 centimeters wide. Air so thick you could taste the desperation. The walls wept with condensation from 20 men breathing the same stale oxygen over and over again. But here's what makes Cell 12 historically significant. It worked exactly as designed. Not as a place of punishment, but as a place of psychological experiment. How many human beings can you compress into a confined space before their sense of individual identity begins to dissolve? How long before they stop thinking of themselves as separate people and start thinking of themselves as parts of a single, suffering organism? The architects had studied ant colonies, beehives. They understood that overcrowding in nature doesn't just cause discomfort, it causes behavioral changes. It makes creatures more compliant, more focused on pure survival rather than resistance, more willing to accept any relief, no matter how small, no matter what it costs. Japanese officials visited regularly during those first months, not to inspect conditions, but to observe results. How quickly did new prisoners adapt to the regime? How long before they stopped making noise? How long before they stopped making eye contact? How long before they stopped thinking of themselves as human beings with rights and dignity and started thinking of themselves as problems to be solved? The psychological transformation was measurable, documented, studied. Within 60 days, most prisoners stopped speaking unless directly addressed. Within 6 months, they stopped maintaining personal hygiene without explicit orders. Within a year, many stopped responding to their own names. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. This was cruelty as technology. The Japanese Empire was engineering a new kind of human being, someone who could survive physical oppression indefinitely without ever developing the psychological resources necessary for resistance. Someone who could be kept alive and functional while being spiritually dead. The guards noticed it too. These weren't sadistic monsters recruited for their love of violence. Most were ordinary men, barely older than the prisoners they supervised. Many had been teachers themselves before the occupation. They understood exactly what they were witnessing, and it terrified them. Guard duty at Seodaemun became a form of punishment for Japanese soldiers who had disappointed their commanders. Nobody wanted this assignment. Nobody wanted to watch human beings dissolve slowly in front of their eyes. The suicide rate among guards began climbing within 6 months of the prison's opening. But the machine was working. That was the horrible truth. It was working exactly as designed. Resistance movements throughout Korea began reporting something unprecedented. Their most passionate activists were returning from Seodaemun as hollow shells. Men who had once delivered fiery speeches about independence now sat silent at meetings. Women who had once organized protests now flinched when anyone spoke too loudly. The prison had achieved something that mass executions never could. It had created living examples of defeat. Walking proof that resistance was not just futile, but dangerous to the very core of human identity. It wasn't enough to kill the rebels. The system needed to kill the idea of rebellion itself. By 1909, Seodaemun's reputation had spread throughout Korea and beyond. Japanese colonial officials in other territories began requesting detailed architectural plans. The prison had become a model to be exported, a template for the systematic destruction of human dignity disguised as law enforcement. But something else was spreading too. Something the architects hadn't anticipated. Stories. Not just stories of suffering, but stories of endurance. Names of prisoners who had maintained their sanity against impossible odds. Accounts of small acts of kindness that had preserved fragments of humanity in the darkest places. The machine was working, but it was also creating something unintended. Witnesses, survivors. People who would carry these stories beyond the walls and into history itself. The Japanese Empire had built Seodaemun prison to erase resistance. Instead, they had built a monument to the impossibility of erasing the human spirit completely. The real test was coming. As Korean independence movements gained strength throughout the country, Seodaemun would be pushed far beyond its design limits. The careful psychological calibrations would collapse under the pressure of sheer numbers. The machine built to break spirits would itself begin to break. And in that breaking, something extraordinary would emerge. Not escape, but something more dangerous to the empire than any individual freedom. The birth of historical memory. The transformation of suffering into testimony. The alchemical process that turns victims into martyrs and oppressors, into the architects of their own moral destruction. The hill still watches Seoul. The walls still stand. But what they contain now is not prisoners. It's proof. Proof that absolute power contains within itself the seeds of its own failure. Proof that there are some things that cannot be broken, no matter how efficiently the breaking is engineered. The machine they built to create silence has become the loudest testimony to the futility of trying to crush the human soul through architecture and time. The sound of keys echoed through the corridors at 4:30 every morning. Not the gentle chime of house keys or the soft click of a jewelry box. These were iron keys, thick as a man's thumb, grinding against locks designed to announce their power. The guards called it the morning song. The prisoners called it the beginning of another death. Silence wasn't just enforced at Seodaemun. It was weaponized. The daily schedule began before dawn with a rule so absolute that breaking it meant instant punishment. No prisoner could speak without direct permission from a guard, not to ask for water, not to report illness, not to whisper a prayer. The human voice, that most basic expression of existence, became contraband. But silence does strange things to the mind when it stretches across months and years. Prisoners began to hear their own heartbeats like thunder. The sound of their own breathing became overwhelming. Some reported that their thoughts grew so loud they were certain others could hear them. The absence of speech didn't create peace. It created a cacophony inside each skull that drove men to the edge of madness. The guards understood this psychology. They had been trained in it. Sudden noises became tools of control more effective than clubs or chains. A metal cup dropped on stone at 3 a.m. Boots stamping in unison outside cell doors. The deliberate slamming of gates during the deepest hours of sleep. Sound became a weapon precisely because silence was a prison. Dr. Yamamoto, a Japanese physician who visited Seodaemun in 1909, documented what he called acoustic conditioning. Prisoners who had been silent for months would physically recoil when addressed directly. Their faces would contort as if they were being struck. The simple act of being spoken to had become a form of assault. Their nervous systems had been rewired to associate human voice with danger. The locks themselves were masterpieces of psychological warfare. Imported directly from Tokyo, each mechanism was designed not just to secure, but to intimidate. The sound of these locks engaging wasn't just loud. It was musical, a specific sequence of clicks and groans that prisoners learned to interpret like a language. 3 clicks meant the night shift. 5 clicks meant meal delivery. 7 clicks meant someone was being taken for interrogation. But the locks had another function. They were visible from inside the cells, mounted at eye level rather than waist level. Prisoners could watch the mechanism engaging and disengaging. They could see exactly how they were being caged. This wasn't accidental. The Japanese had studied animal behavior extensively. They understood that visible restraints create a different kind of psychological pressure than hidden ones. When you can see your cage, you never stop being aware that you're in one. The sound traveled through the prison in ways the architects had carefully calculated. The building's acoustics were engineered so that a lock engaging in one cell block could be heard 3 blocks away. Prisoners lying in darkness always knew when someone else was being moved. They knew when interrogations were happening. They knew when someone didn't return. The building itself became a conductor of fear. Winter arrived early in 1909, and with it came the season of testing. Korean winters are brutal under the best circumstances. Inside Seodaemun, winter became something approaching absolute zero of human experience. Not just because of temperature, but because of the systematic removal of every comfort that makes cold bearable. No blankets. This wasn't cost-cutting. Blankets were specifically prohibited. Prisoners slept on stone floors that conducted the freezing air directly into their bones. Body heat became the only source of warmth, and in cells packed with 20 men, body heat meant pressed flesh. Human beings forced to choose between freezing alone or surrendering the last vestiges of personal space. The walls wept with ice. Condensation from human breath would freeze on the concrete overnight, creating sheets of ice that reflected what little light penetrated the cells. Prisoners would wake to find their hair frozen to the walls, their clothes frozen to their bodies, their tears frozen to their faces. Frostbite was documented not as a medical condition, but as a disciplinary failure. Prison records from this period list dozens of cases where prisoners lost fingers or toes to freezing, but the official cause was always the same: failure to maintain proper body temperature through adequate personal discipline. The system had found a way to make the weather itself into evidence of moral weakness, but the cold revealed something unexpected. Human beings under extreme duress don't just suffer individually, they adapt collectively. Prisoners in Cell 12 developed a rotation system, 20 bodies taking turns at the center of the group where warmth was greatest. No one spoke about it. No one organized it. It simply emerged from the mathematics of survival. The guards reported this behavior to their superiors as evidence of the system working. Prisoners were losing individual identity and becoming part of a collective organism focused solely on survival. But they misunderstood what they were witnessing. This wasn't dehumanization. This was a new form of humanity emerging under impossible conditions. Cooperation so pure it required no language, no leadership, no hierarchy. Just the recognition that survival meant sharing the burden of existence. Cell 12 became legendary even among the guards, not because of the suffering it contained, but because of the silence it produced. 20 men breathing in perfect rhythm. 20 heartbeats, synchronized by proximity and terror. 20 human beings who had learned to exist as a single organism without losing their individual consciousness. The Japanese had tried to create automatons. Instead, they had created something like a choir. The ventilation slits were less than 10 centimeters wide. This measurement appears in every official report about the cell, always presented as a technical specification. But 10 centimeters wide means oxygen for perhaps 5 people in a space holding 20. It means air so thin that speaking becomes physically difficult. It means every breath is borrowed from someone else. Prisoners would take turns at the ventilation slits, not for fresh air, but for the psychological relief of being able to see a fragment of sky. The rotation was managed without words, without conflict, without supervision. Men who had never met before imprisonment learned to read each other's need for that brief connection to the world beyond the walls. 5 minutes at the slit became more valuable than food. But the slits served another purpose. They were positioned at exactly the right height for guards to observe the cells without being seen. The prisoners knew they were being watched, but never knew when. The uncertainty became another form of torture. Were they being observed during their most intimate moments? During their few seconds of rest? During the brief instances when their faces might relax into something approaching peace? The psychological pressure was measurable. Dr. Yamamoto's reports describe physical symptoms that had no medical explanation. Prisoners who lost weight despite adequate nutrition. Prisoners who developed tremors in their hands despite no history of nervous conditions. Prisoners who stopped blinking normally, their eyes remaining open for unnaturally long periods, as if they had forgotten how to trust even the darkness behind their own eyelids. The underground interrogation rooms operated on a different principle entirely. Where the cells used overcrowding to break down individual identity, the interrogation rooms used isolation to destroy the sense of existing at all. Prisoners would be taken from their crowded cells and placed in underground chambers where silence was absolute and human contact was eliminated entirely. The rooms were deliberately disorienting. Ceilings too low to stand upright, floors slanted just enough to make balance difficult, lighting that came from unexpected angles. Everything designed to prevent the mind from establishing any stable reference point. Prisoners reported that after hours in these rooms, they would lose track of whether they were standing or sitting, whether their eyes were open or closed, whether they were awake or dreaming. But the real genius of the interrogation rooms wasn't physical, it was temporal. Prisoners would be kept underground for periods that could last anywhere from hours to weeks, with no way to measure time, no windows, no regular meals, no schedule of any kind. Time became elastic, unmeasurable, infinite. When prisoners were finally returned to their cells, many reported believing they had been gone for years. The slanted floors weren't just disorienting. They were practical. Blood and other fluids would drain towards specially constructed grates. The rooms could be cleaned quickly and efficiently between sessions. The Japanese had engineered these spaces not just for psychological pressure, but for physical torture that left minimal evidence. Everything could be washed away. Pain was applied scientifically, not the random violence of angry guards, but the calculated application of specific pressures designed to maximize suffering while minimizing visible damage. Japanese interrogators had studied anatomy extensively. They knew exactly how much pressure the human body could endure before permanent damage occurred. They knew how to cause agony without causing death. The wooden clubs used in interrogations were precisely calibrated, the length designed to deliver maximum force without allowing the user to strike too powerfully, the weight distributed to prevent accidental fatal blows. Even the torture was engineered with the same precision as the locks and the ventilation slits. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing was left to individual sadism. This was industrial cruelty, but the interrogation rooms revealed the fundamental flaw in the entire system. Pain, when applied systematically, creates not just suffering, but testimony. Every prisoner who survived these sessions carried stories of exactly what had been done to them. The system designed to extract confessions was actually generating witnesses who would carry detailed accounts of Japanese brutality far beyond the prison walls. The guards themselves began to break under the psychological pressure of participating in this machine. Suicide rates among Japanese personnel stationed at Seodaemun reached levels that concerned colonial administrators. But rather than questioning the system, they simply began rotating guards more frequently. The machine was more important than the people operating it. Dr. Yamamoto's final report, filed in early 1910, contains a chilling conclusion. The prison was working exactly as designed. Resistance movements throughout Korea were reporting that their most effective leaders were returning from Seodaemun as broken men. The systematic application of psychological and physical pressure was successfully destroying the capacity for organized rebellion. But Yamamoto also noted something troubling. The stories emerging from the prison were becoming more detailed, more specific, more damaging to Japanese credibility. The very success of the system in breaking individuals was creating a larger problem. The broken prisoners were carrying irrefutable testimony of Japanese brutality into every village and city in Korea. The machine designed to create silence was actually amplifying the voices of its victims. By 1910, Seodaemun had processed thousands of political prisoners. The careful psychological calibrations that had worked so effectively in the early days were beginning to fail under the pressure of sheer volume. The machine built to break spirits slowly was being forced to operate at a speed that produced not submission, but martyrdom. The hill that watched Seoul was about to become something the Japanese had never intended. Not just a symbol of their power, but a monument to the limits of that power. The machine they had built to erase resistance was about to generate the most powerful resistance of all, the transformation of suffering into unshakable historical memory. The sirens began at dawn on March 1, 1919, not from the prison, but from the streets below. Seoul was burning with something the Japanese had thought they had extinguished. The sound of Korean voices raised in unison. The March 1st independence movement had erupted across the country, and suddenly Seodaemun prison found itself at the epicenter of a crisis it was never designed to handle. The prison was built to process dozens of political prisoners at a time. Now hundreds were arriving daily, then thousands. The careful psychological machinery that had operated with surgical precision for over a decade was about to be stress-tested beyond all recognition. And in that testing, the fundamental contradictions of the entire system would be exposed. The mathematical precision that had made Seodaemun so effective became its greatest weakness. Cells designed for 3, already holding 20, now received 30, 40. Numbers that transformed overcrowding from psychological pressure into physical impossibility. Men could no longer lie down simultaneously. Sleep became a rotation system. Standing became the default position for human existence. Prison records from March 1919 reveal the moment when the system began to collapse under its own logic. Daily reports that had once tracked individual prisoners with bureaucratic precision devolved into mass statistics. Approximate count: 400. Estimated total, 800. Unknown number, transferred. The machine built on exact measurements could no longer measure what it contained. But numbers tell only part of the story. The real crisis was happening in the minds of the guards. Japanese soldiers who had spent years learning to dehumanize dozens of prisoners suddenly found themselves surrounded by thousands of people whose humanity was impossible to ignore. The psychological distance that made cruelty possible evaporated when the corridors filled with grandmothers, students, Christian ministers, and children barely old enough to understand why they had been arrested. Guard rotations that had once lasted months were reduced to weeks, then days. Some guards requested immediate transfer rather than continue serving at Seodaemun. Others began reporting sick at rates that concerned their superiors. The Japanese colonial administration discovered that the psychological techniques designed to break prisoners could also break the people applying them when used at this scale. Food became the first system to collapse entirely. The prison kitchen had been designed to provide minimal nutrition to a few hundred inmates. Suddenly, it was expected to feed thousands. Meals that had once consisted of watery rice gruel became bowls of hot water with a few grains floating on the surface. Starvation stopped being a tool of psychological pressure and became simple logistics. Hunger changes everything about human behavior. The careful social dynamics that had developed in the overcrowded cells were overwhelmed by the basic mathematics of survival. 20 men sharing a cell might cooperate. 40 men sharing the same space become a different kind of organism entirely. Competition for resources, conflict over the smallest scraps of food. The systematic breakdown of the cooperative structures that had allowed prisoners to maintain their sanity. But hunger also revealed something the Japanese had never anticipated. Korean prisoners began sharing food with each other even when sharing meant their own starvation. Not occasionally, not as individual acts of kindness, but as a systematic response to systematic cruelty. The machine designed to reduce human beings to their most basic survival instincts, instead triggered something that transcended survival entirely. Prison records document cases of prisoners giving their entire food ration to others they perceived as weaker, elderly inmates fed by young activists who would go without eating for days, pregnant women protected by men who had never met them before imprisonment. The extreme conditions that were supposed to eliminate human solidarity instead distilled it to its purest form. The Japanese administrators faced a paradox they couldn't solve with engineering. The more pressure they applied, the more unified the prisoners became. The more they tried to break individual resistance, the more they created collective resistance. The machine was producing the opposite of its intended result. Tuberculosis arrived in autumn of 1919, and with it came the ultimate test of the system's ability to maintain control through suffering. In normal circumstances, disease in a prison would be contained through quarantine. Sick prisoners would be isolated. Medical treatment would be provided. Basic public health measures would prevent epidemic. But Seodaemun in 1919 was no longer operating under normal circumstances. Quarantine was impossible when every available space was already overcrowded beyond capacity. Medical treatment was impossible when the prison had no functioning medical facilities for this scale of human warehousing. Disease became another form of torture, but torture that the guards couldn't control and couldn't direct. The tuberculosis spread with mathematical precision through the overcrowded cells. One infected prisoner in a space with 40 others created 40 potential infections within weeks. The disease moved through cell 12 like wildfire through dry grass. Men who had survived months of deliberate starvation and systematic psychological pressure died from bacteria that could have been prevented with basic medical care. But the Japanese made a critical error. They began falsifying death certificates to hide the scale of mortality inside the prison. Tuberculosis deaths were recorded as heart failure. Starvation deaths were recorded as natural causes. Prisoners who died from infected wounds were listed as succumbing to pneumonia. The systematic lying created a paper trail that would later become evidence of systematic murder. Dr. Yamamoto returned to Seodaemun in late 1919 and found a situation that bore no resemblance to the carefully controlled environment he had studied a decade earlier. His reports describe scenes that read like something from Dante. Prisoners so emaciated they appeared skeletal. Air so thick with disease that breathing became painful even for visitors. Silence replaced not by the controlled quiet of psychological pressure, but by the exhausted quiet of people too weak to make sound. The interrogation rooms, designed for individual psychological pressure, were repurposed for mass processing. Prisoners were no longer interrogated to extract information or confessions. They were processed like inventory, names recorded, charges assigned arbitrarily, sentences determined by administrative convenience rather than any pretense of justice. The careful psychological machinery had become a simple slaughter apparatus. But even in this chaos, something extraordinary was happening. The prisoners were creating their own systems of organization that the guards couldn't see and couldn't understand. Networks of communication that moved information through the overcrowded cells faster than official prison announcements. Distribution systems that ensured food reached the weakest prisoners first. Leadership structures that operated without hierarchy and without detection. Korean prisoners began teaching each other inside the cells, not just Korean language and history, but mathematics, poetry, music, philosophy. The complete destruction of formal education in Korea under Japanese rule was being countered by the creation of informal universities in the most unlikely classrooms imaginable. Cell 12 became a law school. Cell 18 became a medical training center. Cell 23 became a seminary. The guards reported this educational activity to their superiors as evidence of continued political organization, but they misunderstood what they were witnessing. This wasn't political resistance, this was cultural preservation. The systematic attempt to destroy Korean identity was producing a concentrated effort to preserve and transmit Korean knowledge. The machine designed to create ignorance was generating its opposite. Languages emerged inside the prison that the guards couldn't decode. Not secret codes or encrypted messages, but entirely new forms of communication adapted to the specific conditions of extreme overcrowding. Hand signals that could convey complex information without sound. Touch languages that could communicate through walls. Systems of meaning that existed only in the specific environment of absolute oppression. Winter returned in 1920, but this time the cold wasn't just environmental. It was existential. The heating systems, never adequate, were completely overwhelmed by the population explosion. Prisoners were dying not from torture or disease, but simply from exposure. The machine designed to use cold as psychological pressure had lost all control over temperature. Men were freezing to death while their guards stood in the same rooms. But the cold also revealed the ultimate failure of the entire system. Prisoners were keeping each other warm through cooperative body heat, shared clothing, and synchronized movement. The systematic destruction of individual survival was producing collective survival techniques that no engineering could prevent. Human beings were adapting to impossible conditions by becoming more human, not less. The breaking point came on a night in February 1920 when the guards lost radio contact between cell blocks for the first time in the prison's history. Not because of equipment failure, but because the sound of 40 men breathing in a space designed for 3 had created acoustic conditions that interfered with electronic communication. The prison's architecture, designed for perfect surveillance, had been defeated by simple physics. Order was restored within hours, but the psychological impact on the Japanese administrators was devastating. For 12 years they had maintained absolute control through systematic application of architectural and psychological pressure. In a single night, they discovered that their control was an illusion. The machine worked only when operated within precise parameters. Outside those parameters, it became chaos. The interrogation rooms worked overtime for 72 straight hours after that incident, not to extract confessions, but to reassert dominance through the most primitive means available, violence. But violence applied at this scale and speed produced evidence instead of compliance. Prisoners emerged from interrogations with injuries that couldn't be hidden, stories that couldn't be silenced, and testimony that would spread beyond the prison walls. Bodies began disappearing during night shifts, not through escapes, but through death rates so high that normal burial procedures became impossible. Mass graves were dug outside Seoul under cover of darkness. Prison records that had once tracked every prisoner with bureaucratic precision began showing gaps, omissions, and obvious falsifications. The machine built on exact documentation could no longer document its own operations. But here's what the Japanese never understood. Every body that disappeared was someone's son, someone's father, someone's brother. Every death created a family with an unanswered question. Every falsified record created a discrepancy that would be noticed and remembered and passed down through generations. The systematic elimination of evidence was actually creating the most powerful evidence of all, the evidence of absence. Word was leaking beyond the walls despite every effort to contain it. Not through organized information networks or coordinated resistance movements, but through the simple fact that families noticed when their relatives never came home. The machine designed to operate in secret was becoming visible simply through the mathematics of missing people. The martyrs weren't famous revolutionaries or charismatic leaders. They were ordinary people whose names would be forgotten by history, but whose suffering would be remembered by their families forever. The system designed to create anonymous submission had instead created anonymous testimony. Every unknown prisoner who died in Seodaemun became proof that the Japanese Empire was capable of industrial murder. By 1920, Seodaemun prison had become something its architects never intended, a generator of its own opposition. Every day it operated produced more evidence of Japanese brutality. Every prisoner it processed became a witness to systematic cruelty. Every death it caused created a family with an unforgivable memory. The machine built to create silence had become the loudest testimony to the impossibility of silencing the human capacity for witness, memory, and moral judgment. It was about to face the ultimate test. What happens when a system designed for absolute control encounters the absolute refusal to be controlled? August 15, 1945. The voice of Emperor Hirohito crackling through radio speakers across Seoul, announcing Japan's surrender. In the streets, Koreans who had lived under colonial rule for 35 years were dancing, crying, singing songs that had been forbidden for decades. But inside Seodaemun prison, silence. Not the engineered silence of systematic oppression, not the calculated quiet of psychological warfare, the silence of exhaustion, of trauma so deep it had carved channels in the human soul where sound could no longer flow. Liberation had arrived, but what do you do with a building that has been poisoned by its own purpose? The gates opened at dawn on August 16th. Japanese guards, many of whom had served at Seodaemun for years, simply walked away. No ceremony, no transfer of authority, no accounting for what had happened inside those walls. They left behind keys, uniforms, and records, but they took with them the knowledge of exactly what they had participated in creating. Some secrets would die with them. Others would surface decades later in confessions made on deathbeds to children who would never understand the weight of what they were hearing. The first prisoners to emerge couldn't speak, not because they were physically unable, but because language itself had been damaged. 35 years of forbidden words, forbidden thoughts, forbidden expressions of basic human need. Korean had been illegal for so long that some prisoners had to relearn their own names. They walked into freedom like people emerging from underwater, gasping for air they weren't certain they deserved to breathe. Young activists who had entered Seodaemun as fiery revolutionaries emerged as old men whose hair had turned white in darkness. Grandmothers who had been imprisoned for teaching Korean to children stumbled into sunlight that hurt their eyes after years of artificial illumination. Students who had been arrested for singing Korean songs stood in the courtyard, afraid to make any sound at all. But the most haunting figures were those who didn't emerge, prisoners who had been released from their cells but couldn't leave the building. Men and women who stood in the open doorways, staring at the world beyond, unable to cross the threshold. Freedom had become more terrifying than captivity. The outside world had become alien territory that required courage they no longer possessed. Dr. Yamamoto, now elderly himself, returned to Seodaemun 3 months after liberation to study what he called post-incarceration syndrome. His findings were classified by American military authorities and wouldn't surface for 50 years. The psychological damage wasn't just individual, it was cultural. An entire generation had been systematically separated from their own identity, and the process of reconnection would take longer than the original breaking. Some prisoners couldn't remember their families. Others remembered them too clearly and couldn't bear the thought of being seen in their current condition. Many had been told by guards that their relatives had forgotten them, had moved away, had died. Even when these lies were exposed, the doubt remained. How do you trust your own memory after decades of systematic assault on your ability to distinguish truth from deception? The Korean language itself had been wounded. Prisoners emerged speaking Korean, mixed with Japanese phrases they couldn't eliminate from their vocabulary. Words for basic concepts had been forgotten and replaced with the language of their oppressors. The systematic destruction of linguistic identity had been so thorough that liberation couldn't simply restore what had been taken. The damage would have to be healed word by word, conversation by conversation, generation by generation. But something extraordinary happened in those first weeks of freedom. The prisoners began seeking each other out. Not for comfort, though comfort was desperately needed. Not for support, though support was essential. They sought each other out to compare stories, to verify memories, to confirm that what they had experienced was real and not the product of trauma-induced hallucination. Cell 12 survivors held informal reunions in Seoul parks. 20 men who had learned to breathe in unison now sitting in circles, speaking freely for the first time in decades. They discovered that their memories aligned with startling precision. The details of their suffering weren't individual delusions. They were shared experiences that could be documented, verified, and preserved. These gatherings became the foundation for something the Japanese had never anticipated: systematic testimony. Not propaganda or political rhetoric, but detailed forensic accounts of exactly what had been done to whom, when, and how. The prisoners weren't seeking revenge. They were seeking historical accuracy. They understood that their suffering would mean nothing if it couldn't be transformed into knowledge that would prevent future suffering. But freedom also revealed the extent to which the system had succeeded in its original mission. Many former prisoners couldn't sustain employment. The psychological conditioning that had taught them to respond only to direct authority made independent decision-making almost impossible. Others couldn't tolerate crowds after years of forced overcrowding. Some couldn't sleep in soft beds after decades on stone floors. The Korean government that emerged after liberation faced an impossible choice: what to do with Seodaemun prison. Destroy it and lose evidence of Japanese war crimes? Preserve it and maintain a monument to trauma? Leave it empty and allow it to decay? Each option carried moral implications that no newly liberated nation was prepared to navigate. The decision was postponed repeatedly. Meanwhile, the building remained exactly as it had been left. Cells still equipped with their original locks. Interrogation rooms still bearing stains that couldn't be removed. Ventilation slits still measuring exactly 10 centimeters wide. The architecture of oppression preserved in perfect detail, waiting for someone to decide its fate. Korean authorities began using the prison for their own purposes almost immediately. Political opponents of the new government found themselves imprisoned in the same cells where Korean independence activists had suffered under Japanese rule. The irony was devastating. Liberation had changed the nationality of the oppressors, but not the machinery of oppression itself. Cell 12 resumed operation under Korean management. The same overcrowding, the same psychological pressure, the same systematic dehumanization. Different uniforms on the guards, different languages in the commands, but the same fundamental mathematics of control through suffering. The machine continued operating as if nothing had changed except the ethnicity of its operators. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was something more troubling: the discovery that the systems designed for political oppression have their own logic that transcends the politics they were created to serve. Seodaemun prison had been engineered so effectively that it continued to function according to its original programming, regardless of who controlled it. Former prisoners who had survived Japanese occupation found themselves imprisoned again by their own government. The psychological damage was exponentially worse. To suffer under foreign oppression was comprehensible. To suffer under the government they had sacrificed everything to create was a form of betrayal that destroyed the meaning of their original suffering. International observers who visited Seodaemun in the 1950s reported that conditions under Korean management were virtually identical to conditions under Japanese management. Same overcrowding, same inadequate food, same systematic brutality. The only difference was that Korean guards spoke to Korean prisoners in Korean while applying the same techniques of dehumanization that had been perfected under colonial rule. The building itself seemed to impose its own logic on whoever operated it. Guards who entered Seodaemun as humane individuals found themselves participating in systematic cruelty within weeks. Administrators who intended reform found themselves implementing policies that replicated the worst aspects of the Japanese system. The architecture was conditioning behavior as powerfully as it had during the colonial period. Dr. Yamamoto's classified reports included a disturbing observation. Institutional trauma could be transmitted through physical space. Buildings that had been sites of systematic cruelty seemed to condition the people who worked in them toward continuing that cruelty. The machine wasn't just political or psychological, it was environmental. The walls themselves had become vectors for the transmission of systematic dehumanization. By 1960, Seodaemun had been operating continuously for over 50 years under multiple governments, multiple political systems, and multiple justifications. But the fundamental experience of prisoners remained consistent across all these changes. The machine had developed its own momentum, its own logic, its own immunity to political reform. Korean War veterans imprisoned at Seodaemun for political dissent discovered that their suffering was indistinguishable from the suffering of Japanese colonial prisoners. Same cells, same techniques, same systematic assault on human dignity. The only difference was that their captors spoke Korean while destroying them. The continuity was too perfect to be coincidental. Prison records revealed that some guards had worked at Seodaemun continuously from the Japanese period through Korean independence and into the post-war era. They had learned techniques of psychological control under Japanese supervision and continued applying those techniques under Korean supervision. The knowledge of how to break human beings efficiently had survived liberation intact, but the prisoners were also continuing their own traditions. Networks of communication, systems of mutual support, educational programs conducted in whispers and hand signals. The same techniques that had allowed survival under Japanese rule were being adapted for survival under Korean rule. Resistance had its own continuity that transcended political change. Former Seodaemun prisoners began writing memoirs in the 1960s. Not political manifestos, but detailed technical descriptions of how the prison operated, measurements of cell dimensions, descriptions of interrogation techniques, accounts of daily schedules and food rations. They understood that the most powerful resistance to systematic oppression was accurate documentation of exactly how that oppression functioned. These memoirs revealed something that official histories had obscured. The techniques used at Seodaemun weren't uniquely Japanese. They were universal tools of political control that could be adapted to any authoritarian system. The machine wasn't nationalist, it was technological, and technologies can be copied, improved, and applied in new contexts by anyone who understands their principles. International human rights organizations began investigating Seodaemun in the 1970s. Their reports confirmed what former prisoners had been documenting for decades. Systematic torture, psychological manipulation, and deliberate dehumanization were continuing under Korean management using techniques perfected under Japanese management. Liberation had changed the politics, but not the practices. The building was finally closed as an active prison in 1987, not because of moral awakening, but because of practical obsolescence. Modern techniques of political control no longer required the massive infrastructure of traditional imprisonment. Surveillance technology, economic pressure, and social isolation could achieve the same results more efficiently and with less international scrutiny. But closing the prison didn't eliminate its influence. Guards who had worked at Seodaemun carried their techniques to other institutions. Administrators who had managed the facility applied their knowledge in other contexts. The technology of systematic dehumanization had been perfected at Seodaemun, but it didn't die there. It metastasized. The abandoned building stood empty for a decade while Korean society debated its fate. Demolish it and lose evidence of both Japanese and Korean war crimes? Preserve it and maintain a monument to the continuity of oppression? Transform it and risk sanitizing its history? The decision would determine not just the building's future, but Korea's relationship to its own past. The machine that had been built to create silence was about to face its ultimate test. Could it be transformed into something that would speak truth about the nature of systematic oppression? Could architecture that had been designed to break the human spirit be repurposed to heal it? Could a building that had perfected the technology of dehumanization be converted into a tool for understanding how such systems operate and how they can be recognized, resisted, and ultimately defeated? The answer would determine whether Seodaemun's legacy would be the techniques it had perfected for breaking human beings, or the evidence it preserved of why such techniques ultimately failed to break the human capacity for witness, memory, and moral judgment.